Welcome and thanks for listening to GODDAB Radio, a podcast for progressive thinking people. I'm Mad Dog Mansur, and I'm here to bring you relevant and honest news and information that I find compelling. Our show is often about cannabis, but not strictly, and we will cover a number of other issues depending on what's happening, and I will try to feature guest interviews regularly. At GODDAB Radio, we are ferociously progressive, fiercely skeptical, and vehemently scientific with a no-nonsense attitude we hope you appreciate. It's February 3rd, 2017, and on today's show, we are excited to have an interview with Jason Shams, an American-Iranian who will share his unique perspective on Trump's immigration ban that came down by executive order last week. That is coming up in part 2 of the show. In our first segment, we will have some cannabis news from Oregon and from Utah and discuss Trump's Supreme Court nominee, Neil Gorsuch, and his possible positions on cannabis. Many consider him a qualified replacement for the still vacant Antonin Scalia seat, including his philosophy, which aligns with Scalia's. Then I will discuss Attorney General nominee Jefferson Beauregard Sessions, senator from Alabama and former AG of the southern state before he was elected to the Senate in 1997. Senator Sessions is going to be our next Attorney General, so I thought we would take a better look at him and specifically his comments during the nomination hearings. He apparently thinks torture is a form of unproductive work. And what does that mean in the broader scope of his ability to lead the Justice Department? Quite remarkable, really. We want to give a big thank you to our sponsors, Honey Badger Sungrown and Southern Oregon Alternative Medicine. Without their help, GODDAB Radio would not be possible. Let's get to our Oregon cannabis news first. This first news is from weednews.co, a great website. I suggest you check it out. They've got all the update cannabis news really going on there. And this article was written by Anthony Johnson for weednews.co. Oregon marijuana regulators don't recommend per se THC DUII law. That is remarkable as well. During the 2-year plus process of developing the Oregon Measure 91 legalization law, I, along with many other advocates involved, were adamant about the fact that there could not be a per se THC driving under the influence of intoxicants provision included. The electoral success of the Washington I-502 measure that passed in our northern neighbor with a per se THC DUII law similar to the 0.08 blood alcohol standard put some pressure on Oregon activists to address driving, but we simply were not going to include the unscientific per se THC DUII law in our marijuana legislation initiative. Thankfully, Oregon's voters wisely passed cannabis legalization with over 56% of the vote, understanding that per se THC DUII law was not needed. But that doesn't mean that we're out of the woods. Unfortunately, Oregon legislature has passed some provisions contrary to the intent of Measure 91. Most tragically, the weakening of the state's existing medical marijuana program against the wishes of the M91 campaign team, thus raising legitimate fears that a per se THC law could be passed. A new report from the Oregon Liquor Control Commission, the agency regulating the state's commercial cannabis and alcohol systems, should put to rest any discussion about the need for a per se THC driving standard. As tasked by state law, the OLCC just issued a report to the Oregon legislature regarding the issue of driving and cannabis consumption, and the regulatory agency wisely recommends against a per se DUII law. From the OLCC's legislative report, quote, "The body of evidence that does exist indicates that while attitudes towards driving after marijuana use are considerably more relaxed than in the case of alcohol, the risk of crashes while driving under the influences of THC is lower than drunk driving. Little evidence exists to compel a significant change in status quo policy or institute a per se intoxication standard for THC. Instead, recommendations in this report aim to find avenues to change attitudes towards THC and driving among youth, increase the quality and availability of data, and strengthen the body of research." End quote. While I don't agree with every regulatory decision of the OLCC, I have found the agency very reasonable on cannabis issues and other DUII reports, and their DUII report is in line with their sensible thinking. The regulatory body examined the available evidence and came away with conclusions that any pragmatic person could agree with, that an unscientific per se DUII law is not needed. But we want to develop ways to best everyone, especially minors, about the consequences of driving under the influence of marijuana. The OLCC refusing to recommend a per se THC DUII law mimics the testimony of Evan Sether, sergeant with the Oregon State Police and statewide coordinator of Oregon's Drug Evaluation and Classification Program. Sergeant Sether was confident that existing drug recognition techniques were adequate and not per se THC DUII law was needed. Hopefully, this ends the per se THC DUII issue in Oregon and helps other states avoid the mistake of implementing an unscientific per se THC DUII law as well. Excellent. And he gave a hat tip to the great Leland Berger of Oregon Cannabis Compliance Council for promptly bringing the OLCC report to his attention. Yeah, Lee, thanks for keeping up on a lot of those things. That's really helpful. I'm with Anthony on this. This is awesome news, really. Unfortunately, they didn't really look at it with unscientific view so much as they have other ways of doing it, I think, as much. So, interesting report. And this next story is pretty remarkable. This is from Eugene. Rotary Club inducts first marijuana dispensary owner. This story from Oregon Cannabis Connection, OCCnewspaper.com is the website. And this was written by me, of course, because I am the publisher of the Oregon Cannabis Connection newspaper. Joe Hopkins, owner of the Greener Side Dispensary, is the first cannabis business owner in any major service club. The Rotary Club of Eugene, Oregon, has made history. Earlier today, that's January 24th, they inducted the first marijuana dispensary owner in their club, Joseph Hopkins of the Greener Side, believed to be the first major service club in the world to do so. Eugene Rotary Club's acceptance shows that cannabis businesses are good for the community and provide a needed service. Lane County, Oregon, has been very accepting when it considered medical marijuana in past years. Now they are doing the same for recreational marijuana, or more appropriately termed adult cannabis use. The city of Eugene has few unwarranted restrictions on cannabis business operations. Even under the previous OMMA system prior to legalization in 2014, dispensaries like the Greener Side were allowed to operate in the city. Since Measure 91 passed in 2014, Lane County has been very accepting of cannabis growers, and dozens of dispensaries have opened in Eugene alone. Quote, "The city and the community have been very supportive of us and the Greener Side," end quote, said Joe Hopkins, the Rotary inductee and owner of the Greener Side Dispensary. Quote, "They have been very understanding of how this industry is going through crazy changes. It's awesome how supportive the city is and how they have been accepting of this industry," end quote. Hopkins has been attending the Rotary Club meetings for many months and has become familiar with many of the club members. Most have been welcoming from the beginning, but there was a split in leadership over inviting him to join the club. That was resolved when the new board took over in July of last year, and the club eventually invited him to join. Quote, "A lot of the members were very supportive and happy that I stuck with it," explained Joe. "The first person to shake my hand and tell me welcome to the club was the Lane County Sheriff," end quote. Hopkins' sponsor was Mike Grudzin, who has been a club member for over 20 years. He has been involved in a number of industries over the years, but has always remained with the Rotary Club. The club's projects around Eugene are seen everywhere and include the Holt Center, Cuthbert Amphitheater, and Alton Baker Park, just to name a few. The Eugene Club, which was founded in 1923, is preceded in the Northwest only by Seattle and Portland and has spun off almost a dozen other local Rotary clubs. He's got a great big heart, and Joseph is a great guy. And I said, you would make a great Rotarian, Grusin told the Oregon Cannabis Connection. But it seemed to stir up a hornet's nest, end quote. After many months of Hopkins attending their meetings as a guest of Grusin, and after they checked with the clubs in other cannabis states like Colorado, they decided not to discriminate. The final decision was that Hopkins owns a legal business and is an upstanding citizen, and that was all that mattered. The club president, Jeffrey Robinson, explained to OCC, quote, we honor the diversity of life and people, unquote. For that reason, when we meet at a lunch meeting or a service project, we check our religion, politics, and other controversial issues at the door, Robinson said in the email. We will leave these matters for other organizations to tussle over. We are unified by a single cause, leaders serving humanity, end quote. Robinson added further, quote, one's personal affiliations, beliefs, or types of business practices, as long as they are legal, have no relevance to one's success in Rotary. What matters is our desire to lead out for good in making our community and our world better for future generations, end quote. Rotary is the world's largest service organization with over 1.4 million members worldwide and clubs located in every country. Their motto is service above self. Robinson explained that having a non-political stance and a good reputation are major factors in their ability to aid children, families, and communities in ways government cannot. Quote, I am looking forward to being a part of Rotary and giving back to the community, said Hopkins, unquote. These kinds of major victories help to pave the way for broader acceptance, obviously. Cannabis business owners like Joe Hopkins represent our industry very well, and they show our industry is mainstream when allowed to be. This will hopefully lead the way to other organizations accepting cannabis to help correct all the people's misconceptions. Yeah, big congratulations to Joe at the Greener Side. He's a good friend of mine, has been for years. I knew him in Southern Oregon when I lived down in Medford before he moved to Eugene himself to open his dispensary with his lovely wife, Chelsea Hopkins, the other owner. They're co-owners of that wonderful dispensary. If you're ever in Eugene, stop by and check it out, the Greener Side. And let's get a word here from our sponsors, or at least one of them here. At Honey Badger Sungrown, they care about providing natural products. There are no chemical pesticides and no chemical fertilizers used in their cannabis grow, and they are motivated with a passion for natural cultivation. They take pride in sustainable and environmentally friendly cultivation and produce their product on the beautiful Willamette Valley floor. Honey Badger Cannabis is available at a number of dispensaries, including Grow High Station in Portland and Stash Cannabis Company in Beaverton. Ask for Honey Badger Sungrown products at your dispensary. You can visit them online at www.honeybadgersungrown.com. All right, let's get back to this now. Got a piece here. I picked this up off weednews.co as well, but it's actually written by Philip Smith from stopthedrugwar.org. Philip's stuff is for Creative Commons use generally, and he is really tied into the drug reform movement for sure, especially cannabis. And he wrote this piece, where does Trump's Supreme Court pick come down on marijuana? Where does he come down on marijuana? The record is pretty sparse, as Philip explains. Neil Gorsuch hasn't made any known public pronouncements about marijuana policy. And despite his tenure on the 10th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals in Denver, he hasn't ruled in any cases that directly take up the issue. But he has ruled on some marijuana cases, and he didn't go out of his way to support freeing the weed in them. And there's at least one marijuana-related case he's ruled on that demonstrates a disquieting deference to law enforcement. In Feinberg et al. Versus IRS, Gorsuch ruled that a Colorado dispensary that sought not to report data about its operation to the IRS because marijuana remains illegal under federal law and it feared incriminating itself. But in passing, he offered some commentary on the legal weirdness of state legal but federally illegal marijuana commerce. Quote, "This case owes its genesis to the mixed messages the federal government is sending these days about the distribution of marijuana. Officials at the Department of Justice have now twice instructed field prosecutors that they should generally decline to enforce Congress's statutory command when states like Colorado license operations like THC. At the same time, and just across 10th Street in Washington, D.C., officials at the IRS refused to recognize business expense deductions claimed by companies like THC on the ground that their conduct violates federal criminal drug laws. So it is that today prosecutors will most always overlook federal marijuana distribution crimes in Colorado, but the tax man never will." Unquote. And he marveled at the federal government's contortions as it sought to accommodate commerce in a substance it considers illegal. Quote, "Yes, the Fifth Amendment normally shields individuals from having to admit to criminal activity. But the IRS argued because DOJ's memoranda generally instruct federal prosecutors not to prosecute cases like this one, the petitioners should be forced to divulge the requested information anyway. So it is the government simultaneously urged the court to take seriously its claim that the petitioners are violating federal criminal law and to discount the possibility that it would enforce federal criminal law." Unquote. Gorsuch has also pointedly noted that provisional nature of Obama administration's decision to work with instead of against the states experimenting with marijuana legalization. Quote, "It's not clear whether informal agency memoranda guiding the exercise of prosecutorial discretion by field prosecutors may lawfully go quite so far in displacing Congress's policy directives as these memoranda seek to do. There's always the possibility, too, that the next Deputy Attorney General could displace these memoranda at any time." Yes, of course. This, of course, something of which the marijuana industry and legalization advocates are painfully aware and explains much of the movement's agonizing over the nomination of pot foe Senator Jeff Sessions of Alabama, which we'll be talking about here in a minute. A single signature on a new policy memorandum at the Justice Department could throw the industry into chaos. As Tom Angel notes at the Massroots blog, Gorsuch ruled in 2010 case, U.S. versus Daniel and Mary Quaintance, that a couple charged with federal marijuana distribution offenses couldn't use the Religious Freedom Restoration Act as a defense because their claims weren't sincere. In other words, if you're trying to run a real marijuana ministry, don't be selling weed. But in a 2003 case, Family versus Ryan Wilson versus City of Lafayette and Taser International, that raises disturbing implications that go beyond marijuana policy to the broader realm of police use of force. In that case, Gorsuch held that a police officer's fatal tasing of Wilson, who was fleeing a marijuana arrest, was reasonable. Quote, "The illegal possessing and manufacturing marijuana may not be inherently violent crimes, but outside the medical marijuana context, they were felonies under Colorado law at the time of the incident." And Officer Harris testified without rebuttal that he had been trained that people who grow marijuana illegally tend to be armed and ready to use force to protect themselves and their unlawful investments. Unquote. As Angel noted, that ruling in particular had the National Urban League tweeting its concern and calling for close scrutiny of Gorsuch's record within hours of Trump's announcement of his selection. Overall, Gorsuch hasn't provided a whole lot of hints about how he might rule on cases revolving around the conflict between state and federal marijuana, although he has shown he's aware of it. Any members of the Senate Judiciary Committee representing states where medical or recreational marijuana commerce is legal might want to be asking for some clarification when his confirmation hearings come around. It's a good idea. All right, and before we get to our next piece on Jeff Sessions here, let's get a word from our other sponsor of this segment. Tired of pills? We can help. At Southern Oregon Alternative Medicine, we offer chiropractic and naturopathic medicine, massage, acupuncture, and medical marijuana therapy. With clinics in 19 locations across Oregon and main offices in Portland, Springfield, and Medford, we make it convenient and easy for you too. Southern Oregon Alternative Medicine is the only clinic of its kind to offer both medical marijuana certification and full health care. You can find us online at www.soaltmed.com or southernoregonalternativemedicine.com, or call us at 541-779-5235. So during the Jeff Sessions confirmation hearings, there was a lot of testimony made from both sides. And the testimony that Sessions gave himself, I felt, was the most telling of all in many ways. And what stuck out to me especially was an exchange between Delaware Senator Chris Coons and Alabama Senator Jeff Sessions, the nominee, who was being questioned. And in the testimony, Sessions refuses to call the torturous treatment of being tied to a hitching post torture or punishment. He actually calls it unproductive work. Unproductive work. Now, there's only really one reason for him to do this, and it's because he was doing the work of the governor at the time, the then governor of Alabama, who wanted and had campaigned on prisoners having to work. Apparently, this governor felt that being tied to a hitching post was some form of work as well. I don't know. I guess that governor thought it was productive work. Just ridiculous, really. Anyway, so I just went to C-SPAN and I clipped out the audio from the testimony, and I thought I'd just play it back for you because it's just telling to listen to him get around this question. And Senator Coons, to his credit, keeps after him. He actually really does actually keep after him on it. And Sessions never does admit that it's anything more than unproductive work. So it's just telling as to what we can expect from Sessions as an attorney general. You're going to be doing the bidding of the president, Donald Trump, and we know how stable his decisions are. It's sort of on a whim sometimes, which doesn't bode well for the marijuana industry at all. So here, let's play this clip for you, and then we'll come back and talk about it a little briefly here.
And as the Attorney General, you and the Governor received letters from the U.S. Department of Justice telling you that Alabama's use of the hitching post in both men and women's prisons was unconstitutional and unjustified. But as I understand it, the use of the hitching post continued throughout your term, and you did not act to stop it. During this same period, the state of Alabama was sued not just about hitching posts, but also about chain gangs. Prison policies in Alabama said a man could be put on a chain gang if he failed to shave or keep his bed clean, if he disrespected a member of the staff, and would end up doing hard labor, breaking rocks while being chained together in groups of 5, shackled with 8 feet of chain between men. And these practices, the case that was brought demonstrated, were disproportionately affecting African Americans. In later litigation, the practice of using the hitching post was called by an Alabama judge the most painful and torturous punishment in Alabama, short of electrocution. And in 2002, the United States Supreme Court said using the hitching post was clearly unconstitutional when it was used in Alabama. Can you please, Senator, tell me your view today of the use of the hitching post and chain gang in Alabama corrections, and what your view is of what action you would take today if these practices were restored?
Thank you very much, Senator. That was an initiative of the governor who campaigned and promised that prisoners should work, and he was determined to make that happen. I believe the litigation occurred after my time as Attorney General, according to my records, but we could be wrong. I'll supplement the records for you. Certainly the decision by the Supreme Court and the federal courts were after I left office, I believe. So working of prisoners is an issue that we've dealt with in the Congress of the United States and by state legislatures. I think good employment of a prisoner is a healthy thing. I do not favor, personally, this kind of work. I think it should be more productive work that kind of help the individual develop a discipline that they could use when they go on to private life after they leave prison. After the Supreme Court ruling, I think it's crystal clear what the law is. That was disapproved and disallowed and found to be unconstitutional, and I would absolutely follow that as Attorney General.
In your view, did it take a ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court to clarify that this constituted torture, that it was not just bad corrections policy, it was actually substantively torture of prisoners?
Senator Coons, I don't recall ever personally being engaged in the studying of the constitutional issues at stake. It's perfectly legitimate for prisoners to work, but they should be on decent conditions, and I think it should be the kind of work that's productive and it could actually lead to developing good habits. I've heard some evidence on that subject, so I do not have a legal opinion about the case. Have not studied the details of it.
Just to be clear, what I was pressing you on there was the use of the hitching post, which is a disciplinary measure that had been abandoned by all states but Alabama. It's really reminiscent more of the stocks, the stockade that was used centuries ago, and to me somewhat troubling that it continued without challenge.
A little disturbing that it continued without challenge. Pretty sure Senator Coons is not going to be voting on the Senate floor. I know he didn't vote for him in committee, obviously, which happened on Tuesday, I believe, the 31st. He passed committee 9-11, Senator Sessions, and he's definitely going to get all the Republican support in the Senate for sure, and including some Democrats. So I can't explain how disturbing that is to me that he says this. I mean, first of all, the Supreme Court case that was referenced was filed in 1995. I mean, that was when he started being Attorney General in Alabama. So it wasn't resolved until 2002. But Sessions was Alabama Attorney General from 95 to 97. So the litigation occurred during his term. He ignored the Justice Department. He wasn't crystal clear until the Supreme Court decision was made. And then Senator Coons pushed him on that. I'm so grateful that he pushed him on that. And then he basically didn't have an answer for him. He couldn't answer him. But at the same time, he also admitted that he was doing the bidding of the governor, who had campaigned on this type of thing. He said at the end that when pressed on the fact that it was a hitching post they're talking about, he said it's perfectly legitimate for prisoners to work. He just thinks it needs to be, more productive work? I mean, it's just ridiculous. Of course, Cory Booker, the first time a senator ever testified against a senator that was being put in a cabinet position. That's never happened before. The sitting senator testifying against another one of his colleagues who was going to be put into the Attorney General position in this case. That's a big deal. And not only that, Representative John Lewis also testified against him. So I think that there's plenty of reasons to not support Jeff Sessions that have nothing to do with cannabis, obviously. He's basically a racist. I would consider him, he's basically a homophobe. There's too much evidence to the contrary. He can say all he wants that he's not a racist, but there's just too much evidence out there over the last, that many years that shows that he probably is. And there's definitely evidence that he can't handle gay marriage or anything else. He opposed it every step of the way in Congress. And what's really kind of remarkable is that he actually pressed Sally Yates, who just was fired by Trump earlier this week, on being independent from the president, when he himself couldn't be independent from the governor of Alabama. So, all right, we're gone past our time a little bit here. So pick up part 2. We got Jason Shams, our interview with Jason Shams, an American Iranian with a really unique perspective on what's been going on with the Trump immigration policy. That's in part 2 of our show. So download that and listen up.